In the last video, we said that we get to a steady state level of capital per worker and output per worker. And that level is going to depend on the savings rate and the depreciation rate. But once we get to that level, then there's no growth, right? So if we start out lower, then yes, we're going to grow for a while until we get to the steady state, but then there's no growth after that. And so what we're seeing here is that while the savings rate and depreciation rate are both very important in determining the level of output, they are not in fact important in determining the rate of long-run growth in output per worker. And so we want to sort of focus on that a little bit in this video. So remember, the main assumptions we made at the beginning of chapter 11 was that population isn't growing and technology isn't growing. And so we saw that, if we do destroy some capital, or we just start with a really low level of capital in the economy, then we will grow for a while, right? We saw the example of France after World War II, which had a lot of capital destroyed during the war, and so they grew very quickly as they replaced that capital. But eventually they get to the steady state of capital per worker and output per worker, and then they don't change. And so long-run growth stops at that point in the absence of technological progress. And so we want to think a little bit more about that and think about, all right, well, what happens when the savings rate changes? What happens if we do have some technological growth? And what happens to consumption? Because savings is the flip side of consumption, right? Everything you don't consume, you save, but everything you save, you don't consume. So that means that savings does come at a cost of consumption, and the goal, if there is one, of economic growth is not to always grow output per se, but to grow consumption. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this video as well. So if the savings rate does increase, right? So say the economy goes from a savings rate of 10% to 20% or 20% to 30%, then we'll get a shift up in our investment per worker, right? These green lines. And so the pale green line is our original savings rate, and the darker green line is our new savings rate. And so initially, our equilibrium is this level K0 over N, and output is Y0 over N. And then the increase in savings rate increases capital per worker because now we are investing more than is depreciating every year. So next year's capital per worker is higher than this year's capital per worker until we get to our new equilibrium, our new steady state. And so our new steady state has higher capital per worker and higher output per worker. And so we do grow for a while, right? We're going to grow while we are moving from K0 over N to K1 over N. And so this is, you can think of, this is what happened, in France after World War II, in Germany after World War II, in England after World War II, in Japan after World War II, is we're adding a lot of capital per worker to replace everything that was destroyed. And we're growing faster, and then we get to our new steady state. And in the absence of technological progress, then we stop, right? And so we have short-run growth, but not long-run growth. So we can sort of think about how this will happen over time. So here we have time on the horizontal axis, and we have output per worker on the vertical axis. And, once we increase the savings rate, which happens at time t here, then output will grow. It will be concave, depending on sort of the production function, which is also concave. And eventually we'll get to our new level of capital per worker and our new level of output per worker with the higher savings rate. And so the higher savings rate will increase the level of capital per worker and output per worker, but it will only increase growth in the short run, right? So growth is higher here in the short run, and then eventually it stops. And so, but we know that one of the important factors of the last 100 years in industrial economies, 200 years, has been long-run economic growth. And so how do we explain that? Well, one way to explain that is with technological progress. And so as we're going to see, this is kind of a preview of chapter 12. With technological progress, then we have sort of a steady state growth rate, growing at the rate of technological progress. And a higher savings rate then will actually increase the growth rate for a while until we get to our new sort of steady state of what we're going to call capital per effective worker or output per effective worker. And then it goes back to where it was. So, the growth rate here is the same as the growth rate here, while the growth rate between those 2 points is higher. It's growing faster. And so you can think about like France, we said they had growth rate of output per worker of like 9.6% between 1945 and 1950. That makes a lot of sense. And then eventually they sort of settled back down to a level of growth similar to the United States and other industrialized countries. So what we really care about, right, is not how much is produced, but how much people get to consume. And I think it's easy to think about when we think about, well, what if we saved everything, right? And if we saved everything, that means we'd have lots of investment. That means our capital stock per worker would be really high. Our output per worker would be really high, but we would have nothing to consume. And if we have nothing to consume, then we're dead. And so that doesn't really matter. So we want to think about consumption, right? Governments can also affect savings rate, right? They can change public savings. They can use taxes to affect private savings. So they might have tax benefits to increase savings. So, like one of the benefits of a value-added tax might be that it taxes consumption, and so it provides incentives to increase savings. Government can also invest on their own, right? And I think this is important. We have that sort of G in our C plus I plus G, but that government spending is really broken into both consumption and investment. Some of the government spending is just used that year, and that's consumption, but other of it is investment, things like building roads, and even things like education, right? We're going to talk in the next video about human capital. And human capital is actually really important for long-run growth. And so we'll talk a little bit about it in chapter 11, then we'll talk about it again in chapter 12. But just think that government can both consume and invest. And if they invest, that will increase the amount of capital per worker, right? If you think about something like the interstate highway system in the United States, that is a infrastructure that is very valuable for lots of firms, and therefore increases the amount of capital per worker for pretty much everybody. But what we really want to think about is, well, what's the level of capital per worker that leads to the highest level of consumption? Because that's what we should really care about in terms of our population. Is not how much they produce and output per person, but how much they get to consume per person. And so we can graph that, right? The shape of this graph is going to depend on the actual production function. We're going to do a numerical example coming up, but we can sort of think about the extremes, right? So if we don't save at all, if our savings rate is 0 in a closed economy, then even if we start with a lot of capital, that capital is going to depreciate eventually to 0. And if we if we have 0 capital per worker, output per worker is 0, consumption is therefore 0. On the other hand, if we save everything, right, so our savings rate is 100%, then we're going to have lots of capital per worker. We're going to have the maximum amount of output per worker, but we still don't get to consume anything because we're saving all of it. And so there will be some point somewhere in the middle, right? As I said, the shape will depend on the production function, where we have this golden level of the savings rate, a golden level of capital per worker, a golden level of output per worker that maximizes our consumption per worker. And so we'll do an example with a Cobb-Douglas production function. But basically, if you're over here on this side, then you're saving too much. And actually saving less, while it will reduce capital and will reduce output, will actually increase consumption. On the other hand, if you're over here, then increasing the savings rate will increase capital per worker, output per worker, and will increase consumption per worker until you get to this point. So I think this is an important concept to think about is, eventually you can save too much. And while the United States is probably to the left of that golden level of savings, it's possible that a country like China, which has really focused on investment and building up its capital stock, could be to the right of that golden level. And so actually reducing their savings and investment would allow a higher level of consumption per person in China. This is obviously an empirical question, right? In terms of, all right, well, if we increase the savings rate, what does that actually do to consumption? And in our sort of stylized models, it's actually, a little hard to tell where economies will fall.